So we've talked quite a little bit now about the impact of alcohol and understanding how to think about alcohol and classifying it. So let's look at what is the reasons why people drink. So why do some people drink so much? Why do we have such an issue with alcohol? And for that, I'm going to be presenting some work from my conceptual framework for my master's that I'm doing at the moment, which is around emotional competence, because emotional regulation and addiction has got a very strong relationship. And I'm just going to put that into the context of my study. For those of you that want more information, please check out my YouTube channel on Master Your Dragon, which specifically looks at understanding how emotional regulation works. So I use the analogy of a dragon and talking about the dragon representing that survival part of yourself. So all of us as human beings have a survival brain. It's our limbic brain, our amygdala, our brain stems, our whole endocrinological system, as well as your physical body has an ancient survival system that has to do with survival, right? So this is where all your fight, flight, fright responses lie. This is where you get hungry and thirsty, and all our basic drives lie within this survival part of ourselves. Much later in our evolution, we have a prefrontal cortex. This is where all our higher values and ideals lie. This is where we think about things like meaning and purpose. And I want you to imagine that this higher part of you is what is controlling the survival part of yourselves as we go through daily life. So ideally, our consciousness is always a play between this master having to control this dragon. And I like to think of it as that when the survival brain is in play and our master is not in control, that's sort of your worst self that steps forward. Where our best selves is when we actually have our survival brain under control and we can live according to our own higher values. I'm not going to cover this slide in detail, but it's going to look a little bit at the behaviors of how do we behave when our survival brain is in charge and how do we behave when our prefrontal cortex is in charge. And why this is important is because alcohol kicks out your prefrontal cortex higher functioning. So it slows down all of these higher functions and you're basically only sitting within your worst self. So the kind of things that happens, and you can imagine this for somebody who's had a little bit too much to drink, is that you very much go into present view. You're only thinking about what's happening in the moment. You're slightly within survival, so you might be a little bit more paranoid and vigilant that moment. You might be quite judgmental, this emotive judgment that one feels when one's sitting within that survival phase, and it influences the way you think. So this is where we make assumptions, where we jump to conclusions. Thinking is very black and white, not the cleverest part of ourselves because it's helping us to make quick decisions in a survival scenario. And you can think of dragon mode being quite self-focused, being quite proud, being quite narcissistic. And this is where you see a whole lot of negative behaviors, which we're going to look at in a second. And this is when people become aggressive and dangerous. And you see these people coming into A&E on a Friday and Saturday night when they've had too much to drink. When our prefrontal cortex is able to kick in, that's when we're able to have sort of a balcony view. We're able to have perspective on a scenario. This is where we're able to access the more intelligent, rational part of ourselves. And this is where we're able to have qualities like being compassionate and tolerant, being humble and generous. So our best selves come into play when we're able to keep this dragon under control. What happens when the survival brain kicks in is that there's particular emotions that the survival brain uses to try and help us meet our drives and follow our particular instincts. And there's three primal emotions that gets triggered when we are in the survival mode. Fear and rage is obvious. So fear is when there's a threat and you feel you have to move away from that threat. Rage is the biological impulse to destroy an obstacle that's in its way. And you've all seen people who are either psychotic or under the influence of alcohol in that rage mode, this irrational need to destroy something in their way. I want to talk very briefly about panic grief. So this is also a very basic emotion that we experience. You can see it, for example, in small children when they lose their caregiver in the shopping center and the toddler starts screaming blue murder. So what our bodies does is when we disconnect from somebody, we create a very powerful emotional response to make us cry out, literally in emotional pain, so that hopefully the caregiver can come. So just like fear is a very specific primal emotion, rage is a very particular emotion, this feeling of grief, of being abandoned, of feeling lost, of feeling like you have failed, of feeling that something is, that you are somehow excluded, creates an extraordinary feeling of emotional pain. And the reason why I emphasize that is because very much specific substances, especially alcohol and especially opioids, specifically ameliorates this feeling. So because pain actually, the thing that if somebody, that little child is screaming in the shopping center, when mom comes and gives him a hug, it actually produces endogenous endorphins that makes a child feel happy and loved and included again. And alcohol and opiates can give you a semblance of that feeling, which is why this as an emotion is the most powerful emotion that could potentially lead to addiction. So the other thing that's interesting, and again, my YouTube channel's got more on this, is that there's various counterproductive behaviors we engage in when we are within those distressing emotions to try and make ourselves feel like we're controlling it. It's very unpleasant to be anxious. It's very unpleasant to be irritable or angry, very unpleasant to be upset. And some people might have more fight things they do. So you criticize, you overanalyze, you gaslight and manipulate. Some people try and please. Some people get very much obsessive and compulsive. Some people worry. But I want to focus a little bit on the avoidance strategies that some people do when they get stressed or feel pain. And one of the main ways that we respond to pain or try and control pain is by trying to distract ourselves from that. And that could be through using substances like alcohol and opiates and your Netflix binges, et cetera, et cetera. But this as a particular mechanism of dealing with pain is a very much a direct way into addiction. So to summarize what I've just said, if you have a trigger, so something happens in your life that makes you go into survival mode and you experience one of those strong emotions, especially the panic grief one, this is going to produce a behavior to try and get away from that emotion, and distracting being a particularly powerful one in the world of addiction. And then this distracting, avoiding ends up leading to you, for example, using alcohol, which then has a negative impact on your life, which can cause more stress, and you can find yourself within that cycle. So if we then try and understand heavy drinking, there's a lot of discussion about, is this genetic? So it's interestingly that we do know that definitely if you've got a first degree relative with alcohol use, there's a higher risk of there being alcohol use within the family. What's interesting is we're not sure, we haven't found a genetic link for that. And there's a question about whether this is not much more to do with how the family, what the child learns in terms of how the family manages particular stress. So there's much more of an understanding, though, that we're not really seeing it as a disease or some genetic hereditable thing that you can't do anything about, but it's much more to do with how you yourself deal with grief and anxiety. And the biggest driver of heavy drinking is alcohol being used as a coping strategy. And this is important to understand, because you can't address alcohol use unless you give somebody different coping strategies than the ones that they are using. So there's a few things that might contribute to why you're using alcohol as your coping strategy. The one might be just your temperament or your personality trait. So if you are somebody who are very emotionally sensitive to the world around you, if you're really sensitive to pain in others, for example, and pain even in animals, so more sensitive people or people who have more social anxiety or more aware of their social environment might find themselves more tempted to use something to ameliorate that. And then in combination with that, if you're the kind of person that don't manage your stress by going to shout at somebody, but manage your stress by rather going and having a quiet drink around the corner. So these kinds of factors can then can make you underlyingly more susceptible to might want to use alcohol as a coping strategy. Then it depends very much on the environmental factors. So if you grew up in a family where your parents always use alcohol when they are stressed or frustrated, it's more likely that you might use alcohol. Or if you're in a scenario where that's how all your friends deal with the world, or there's a lot of social exposure to alcohol, that might expose you then to heavy drinking. Interestingly, in a study, and this was a study they did on the students in terms of stresses, the biggest kind of stress that leads to drinking is relationship stress. And you can now see where that matters. So this feeling of emotional pain or feeling rejected or feeling alone is the most thing that might lead to actual heavy drinking. Although work and academic stress can also do so. And also specifically, because that also leads to this feeling of grief, as a feeling of failure. So if you're somebody that's quite sensitive, or things are going wrong in your life, or you've made a mistake, or you're a victim of a lot of verbal abuse, for example, you're getting constantly told how worthless you are, that pain might also be something that you find alcohol actually ameliorates. So alcohol becomes your coping mechanism. And of course, any of our mental health illnesses, depression, anxiety, conditions like ADHD, which influences your impulse control, all of these creates more feelings of fear and pain. And if you are somebody who finds that your way of coping is by avoiding or distracting, alcohol might be what you are using to manage that scenario. We do need to talk a little bit about substance dependence. And as I've mentioned earlier, most of our substance use disorders that we see are going to be that harmful use. So heavy drinking, people are drinking too much and it's mucking with their lives, but not everybody is dependent. So only 2.6% of drinkers are actually dependent on alcohol. And the old DSM-4 criteria had all of those, how you would classify dependence. So tolerance, craving, withdrawal. So that very much has to do with the alcohol has got. So there's been a lot of consideration is there a gene that makes you more likely to get dependent on any substance? So is there a thing that might make you more quicker for you to get physically addicted? It's not yet been substantiated. Some people think there might be, but the idea is that it's actually irrelevant because physical addiction is not what creates long-term heavy substance abuse. And the interesting story was that is this sort of inevitable strange cohort study that happened during the Vietnam War. So in the Vietnam War, there was a lot of people who, a lot of the soldiers obviously in Vietnam was using opiates and were actually provided with opiates to manage the horror of war. So there was a huge rate of opiate addiction because opiates are very addiction. So they were using opium specifically. And there was a huge concern already from the American government is what's going to happen when all these boys come back home. So the soldiers then returned after the Vietnam War and they were actually followed up. So the government actually kept track on them because there was this nervousness about this opium addiction that they. And what they found is that 3 to 5 years after the boys had returned home, the addiction level amongst those soldiers was exactly the same as the normal population. So those guys, everybody was physically addicted. So of those 30% that was physically addicted, those that had good family support and those that did not have any other factors that drove addiction was able to get through their physical addiction and move on with their lives. And was only those that was using it as a coping mechanism in their general lives who didn't have support structures who actually stayed addicted. So quite often we focus on the addiction aspect, but actually that's not the issue. We have to focus on the coping mechanism. Talking about addiction is very important because substance dependence is very important because